Hello and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with my two co-hosts.
I'm Jeff Poole. And I'm Joe Lalo.
And we've got a cool guest for you this week, coming to you live from Seattle with purple hair, Cat Rambo, who is the president of SFWA. I said it right this time. The Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. Did I get that right? I didn't actually look it up.
Actually, that's not right. It's of America instead of association.
Oh, no. See, I should have looked it up. But fortunately, you are here to correct me. And Kat will also be talking, we're going to ask her about some short fiction. She's put out some writing books, so we're going to be asking for some writing tips, talking a bit about SFWA, the acronym that I now know, and what it can do for you as an author. And just as a quick bio, Kat, as I said, lives and writes and edits in the Pacific Northwest. Her work has appeared in such places as Asmobs, Weird Tales, and Strange Horizons. She was the fiction editor of the award-winning Fantasy magazine and appeared on the World Fantasy Award ballot in 2012 for that work. Her story, 5 Ways to Fall in Love on Planet Porcelain, was a 2012 Nebula Award finalist. She attended the Clarion West Writers Workshop in 2005, which I've always been curious about, so we ask her about. And as I said, she's the current president of SFWA. Kat, welcome to the show. Would you like to say anything in your introduction that I mangled or did not get right, or just elaborate?
I'm going to say that actually it's contested whether it's SFWA or SFWA. I say SFWA. One of my favorite SFWA moments is that I actually wrote to Tom Lehrer and said, can we produce a mangled version of your song, Silent E, Silent F, for SFWA? And he wrote back and said, I have no idea what you're talking about, but certainly. So that will appear at some point to settle this once and for all.
All right. That's good to know that no matter how badly I mangle it, perhaps it was okay because other people are doing the same thing. Well, it looks like you're a big fan and writer of short fiction. I know you have a couple novels out too. Do you want to talk a little bit about your publishing road so far?
Sure. I was a tech writer and computer person for a long time until in 2005, I decided if I was going to be a writer, I really needed to sort of be serious and start doing that. And I quit my job at Microsoft and went off to the Clarion West Writers Workshop, where I studied with Octavia Butler, Connie Willis, Andy Duncan, Eltimo Duchamp, Gordon Van Gelder, and Michael Swanwick. I don't want to leave any of them out because they'd be offended. And then I kept writing stories after that. And I've written, I think, over 200 short stories and am working on a third novel. So, yeah.
Now, to go from Microsoft employee to unemployed writer at a workshop, that must have been a little bit of a pay cut. This sounds like quite a commitment that you made.
Well, I'm lucky in that I had a partner who said that they were willing to pay the rent for a while. And that is one of the things that I think is really important, that we acknowledge that so many of us depend on our partners and spouses, sometimes not even just financially, but in terms of taking the kids and making time for us to write, and even just saying, yes, keep going.
Now, you said that you've written over 200 short stories and 3 novels. For people who are just starting to dip their toes into writing, what do you think is a good way to get started? Should people start with short fiction?
I think that short fiction is a very reasonable way to start your career and to kind of get your name out there and get some stories published and get acquainted with some editors. But no one's going to make money off short fiction unless they're willing to sort of move to a cabin in Utah and live off lentils. I mean, it just, short fiction, you can make a little bit of money off it, but the money is, I think, usually more with actual novels. But the thing is that a novel is a long-time commitment. As you all know, it's not a matter of months, perhaps years. Whereas a short story, sometimes you can sit down at the desk and finish it that day, and then you can be ecstatic because you've finished a thing. So I prescribe a sort of mixture of the two, but some people like short stories more than novels and vice versa.
Now, I've been doing a thing recently where on the weekend I'll write a short story. For the last 12 weekends, I've been doing that just as an exercise because I've found that I'm less good at short stories. Number one, because they tend to become novellas, and number two, because they're just less forgiving. Like there's no room for there's no flexibility. You gotta trim all the fat out, which is something that I don't have a lot of skill with. So like if somebody has trouble with a short story, do you think they should keep at it until they get better at it, or do you think that maybe they're just a longer form writer?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit like saying, is a pianist better at playing jazz or classical, maybe? But I would argue that one wants to sort of dabble in both. I love writing flash fiction because it makes you get at the bones of what a story is. It makes you think very hard about what constitutes a story versus what doesn't constitute a story. And it lets you try out techniques and has a lot of other advantages. But I think that's the thing about it, is a short story is a good chance to try out your theories on pacing or plotting or character development and do it in a much less demanding way than a novel. A novel is just so much more complicated.
So my question for you is, for those authors who just starting out with no budget to work with, how would you recommend they handle editing? Self-editing or possibly an unbiased opinion from a neutral party? What would you say?
I think, well, first and foremost, I think writers should get a crit group if they can. I think this is a good thing because a good writing group will keep you motivated, will keep you sane, and will hopefully give you decent feedback. Now, those folks, you should not ask for copy editing. Copy editing is an unreasonable thing to expect of them. Although there's often people who just be like, I love to copy edit, and will do it anyway.
They are few and far between, let me tell you.
Well, often they're writers procrastinating on other stuff, right? So they're just like, I don't want to write. I'll go critique Kat's story really thoroughly.
That's a good way to put it.
That's it. But I think, the other thing is you can swap with people. I mean, because budget is budget, and you can swap for, you can swap critiques, you can swap copy editing, you can swap, and say, hey, I will produce some images that you can use on social media, or I will watch your kid for an evening, or, bake you a pie. I have taken many swaps in my time.
Does that work in order to get a story published from back in your editor days? Would a pie get you a slot in Fantasy Magazine?
No, but it might get you a copy edit. So, yeah.
All right. Well, you mentioned workshops. I was in the science fiction and fantasy online writing workshop for years. I would say a couple different times every time I got serious about my writing, and then life or World of Warcraft distracted me. But it was a great experience. And I remember looking at Clarion many years ago, and I think we should tell people who don't know, it's kind of like a 6-week writing workshop in the summer.
Right. There's Clarion West and there's Clarion San Diego, and sometimes there's other Clarions pop up. But yeah, it's like a 6-week boot camp, and you're spending the time with 17 other writers, and everyone is producing a story a week. And so you're critiquing 17 stories a week as well. So it's very intensive. It's at a location somewhere on the University of Washington campus that I am forbidden to disclose. But it is a really very good, very intensive experience.
I think I was actually in Seattle still at the time, so I was looking at the Clarion West in the secret undisclosed location.
There you go.
Down by the canal probably, and the ducks and all that. But I was a little intimidated. I think you have to live there, right? And you're like,
oh yeah, you do have to be.
You live in I was going to say barracks. That's not what they are, dorms.
Well, it's a sorority house now. I'm sorry, an undisclosed sorority house. So we're on the University of Washington campus. So yeah, it's you do have to. At least you have a room to yourself, which I think is nice. But it's a more primitive existence than many people have gotten accustomed to.
It did seem that a lot of the people who went were professionals. Like, you would think only a student would have time to like take off in the summer and do it, but it's like a lot of people. And then they're, you know, they're really big names. Like you were saying, people come on to be really recognized, you know, either award-winning or best-selling authors. Do you think, would you recommend that experience now for somebody who is interested in getting started or getting serious maybe?
Well, I came through, in my Clarion West was the world's most discouraging person to come through a Clarion West class with, and that's Ann Leckie, who won like all sorts of awards all over the place, and Rachel Swirsky, who won all sorts of awards all over the place. Yeah, if that's your groove, and if you do well with workshops and you like people, absolutely. And I think it can be amazing. I think sometimes people expect more of it than they're going to get. And I think it's one of those cases where you also have to kind of put energy in the workshop, and the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. You are not going to sort of like magically find an agent who's going to go, oh my God, you are a genius. I am now going to do, you know, like jettison all my other clients and devote my life to promoting you. And, you know, that's just not going to happen. Well, I mean, it's not going to happen anywhere. I really enjoyed Clarion and think that for people who are willing to put energy into it and come really wanting to network and meet people, it can be amazing.
All right. So I've never done a workshop. Well, never like a large scale one. I did a business thing, but not an actual craft workshop. And I know as particularly if there's a very, we'll say, charismatic or forceful teacher, you might end up with an entire class of people who have stunningly similar aspects to their writing because it was muscled into them by that person. Like, is there ever a concern that you're going to lose your uniqueness of your voice if you subject yourself to that?
So I've never seen that happen at Clarion. I mean, and I have seen like people, like for the week that teacher was there, produce something, like Andy Duncan was there, and then we all suddenly produced stories where it was like comedy and drawl all over the place. I think that's a valid worry, but I mean, in terms, since you've only got the person for a week, they can't scar you too deeply.
That makes sense. You know, it's not like they're locking you in there for a year and you come out brainwashed.
That's it. That's it.
You also mentioned that in a workshop like that, you are critiquing as well as being critiqued, and that's an entirely separate skill from writing. Like, what if you're not any good at critiquing, or like, is that going to be a problem for you at a workshop?
I think that critiquing is so much more useful than being critiqued, honestly. It is something that makes you articulate your theories of fiction. Often when you are critiquing somebody's work, the things that you engage with are the things that you're having trouble with. And often it is in the process of looking to see how somebody else has done it and how you would fix it, helps you solve whatever issues you're having with it. I think, and that's the main reason that I think I suggest people that they get either an online or face-to-face critiquing group, is that it is just so useful to read other people's work and be able to think about stories in a much more neutral way than when you're looking at your own work.
So let me ask you, what would you say would be some affordable workshops aspiring authors could or should attend?
So you're talking about online or face-to-face?
Either or.
Either or. So face-to-face, the ones that you kind of go away for, certainly Clarion West, I'm going to obviously say that, and I think Clarion at San Diego is just as good. I hear great stuff about Viable Paradise and Odyssey. I went through Taoist Toolbox, and that's for novels. In terms of online workshops, I feel obliged to point out that I myself run a number of online workshops through my Rambo Academy for Wayward Writers. But other people that are doing classes that I think do really well, right now, Kay Tempest Bradford and Nisi Shawl are doing a Writing the Other workshop online that I think is awesome. I know that Mary Robinette Kowal gives classes, and oh my God, I cannot remember her name, and I should. I know Daniel Older gives classes. I'm trying to think, there's a lot of people that give classes. Well, and one of the things that I've done with my school, if I might chill for it for just 30 seconds more, is that I brought in a lot of other people. Like Ann Leckie's come in and done a class on space opera. She's about to give it again. Swirsky's come in and done a lot of classes. I just had Shannon McGuire do a class on crypto and xenobiology, which was amazing. And it was so much fun that at the end of the class, all the students were like, let's do this again, and we'll explore areas that Shauna didn't get to. And so we're going to do it again. So, I mean, I think I provide a nice range of people.
All right. So, of course, I have to ask, when you're looking for creative writing workshops, is there anything to be on the lookout for so you can avoid it? Absolutely.
I think anytime anybody gives you writing advice and says this is the one true way, you should instantly be wary. Right? Anytime anybody is like, this is the only way to do things, you should be super careful. I would be careful. See, I want to phrase this well. There's an industry out there of people that are making money off writers and making money off, want to be writers, and there's huge amounts of scams and contests and vanity publishers, and there's workshops. And honestly, if something is priced super high, I would sure look at it really hard and be like, is this giving me a name? Can I see testimonials by other students? Can I talk to people that have been there? If you're spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a face-to-face workshop, I am frugal by nature, and I want to get my money's worth out of such things. And so I would definitely check them out ahead of time.
Yeah, fortunately with the internet now, it makes it a lot easier to look things up, and almost right away you'll find like, look out for this.
Yeah.
Beware. I just wanted to say that I also loved critiquing. That was like my favorite part of workshops, and I felt I learned so much. Like I would be like, why is this not working for me in this person's story? And then hopefully I could try to apply that to my own stuff while hopefully giving them some useful advice too. And also, as Joe was saying, I feel like because I've heard this actually from a lot of professional writers, that workshops are not good because all the voices come out sounding the same. But I feel like it's kind of like a hardening process. And like maybe for a while you start writing like people you're emulating or you love or taking the advice. But then you come out of it and you kind of find your voice and you're more confident in it in the end. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that before we?
I kind of wonder if it's something that isn't truer of, say, the literary and MFA workshops than, say, of the genre workshops. And I have a master's from Hopkins. I came through their writing workshop, so kind of seen both sides. Because I know they're often, like everybody was writing at the time that I came through, everybody's writing Raymond Carver stories because Raymond Carver was very, very hot. And so everybody's writing these ineffable stories that would end with, and then somewhere something changed, and you just feel like, what changed? And so I think sometimes schools will perpetuate kind of literary fads in that way. But, like if you took a class from a good, like Brandon Sanderson has a really distinctive style, but when he teaches, he's not producing nothing but little Brandon Sandersons because he's being a good teacher and he's looking for kind of like, what is this person's strengths that they can work on and what are their weaknesses that they need to address? How do I make them more them?
All right, awesome. Because I'm a fan of workshops, and because I feel like now it's so easy to self-publish, and it's like such a viable route that so many people put their first novel up, and sometimes that works out, but sometimes you're like, that was a big mistake.
Yeah,
definitely.
Well,
and go ahead.
It's a little bit like the rock tumbler. I mean, and one of the reasons that you send your short stories out is because you really kind of, I think at least initially, you need to get a decent idea of how bad or good you are. And it's very hard when you first come in to just, and often people are just like, I am the best thing since sliced bread, and sometimes those people need a couple rough edges knocked off them before they put a book up.
It can be a horrifying experience putting your first chapter or your first story up there, but especially if you're a sensitive soul. But I think everybody should do it.
Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned short fiction, and I'm curious because I haven't really been following the magazines lately. That used to be the only route. You submitted, so you got those pro sales, then you joined SFWA, and hopefully you found an agent, and then you could get a novel deal. And now that there's other options, I was curious: are there a lot of people still doing it? Are the magazines viable, and should we be submitting to them?
Absolutely. I think there's a whole bunch of really great magazines right now, and they are printing, I think, some of the most interesting kind of, I don't want to say cutting edge, right? Because that's a technology stuff, but like some of the most interesting, edgy stuff, right? Some of the places that science fiction should be going. And so Clark's World is one. Lightspeed Magazine, Fantasy Magazine, and of course, Magazine of Fantasy, Science Fiction, and Asimov's and Analog are all three of them still around. Uncanny Magazine is publishing great stuff. And there's a whole host now of magazines, many of them online, which I think is super cool. And you're also seeing, I think, because of electronic publishing, a resurgence in novellas. And not just in terms of self-publishing, but I noticed like Tor recently was just like, novellas are the wave of the future. And, some of us knew that already.
Yeah, I remember when they came online with their Tor.com, and they were like one of the first ones accepting submissions, like, give us 20,000 words. Everybody else was like, no more than 8,000.
Yeah,
you got to bring a pie if you want us to publish something more than 8,000 words.
And it's true. I mean, and that's one of the problems with writing novellas and novelettes is just that they're a much harder sale. That's why you should write Flash. Flash is easier because it's cheaper.
Unfortunately, there are so many magazines out there that if you don't get into the pro ones, there's nothing wrong with continuing to try. I never could get a pro sale. I was like so stoked when I got like a little $5, made it into an anthology. I'm like, yes, I am published.
Well, I think, like I've got what's in back of me. Most of these are anthologies that I'm in. And, often that's enough to buy yourself lunch.
At the very least, you get some reader copies. You can show your parents, your friends. Do you have any tips for those that want to submit to magazines, since you have the editorial experience that maybe we should know before sending stuff out?
I mean, for one thing, read the guidelines. Their guidelines are there for a reason, and one of them is to flush out the people who are so difficult to work with that they cannot follow the guidelines. The guidelines are there for a reason. They're also there to help flush out the stuff that's just absolutely unsuitable. Go a little further, and if the magazine is available, look at a couple of issues of it. Most magazines that are online, even if they're behind a paywall, will stick up 2 or 3 stories online for you to read. Track your submissions. Don't just, I'm sure this is going to surprise you, but I run into people who are just like, yeah, I just send it out and I don't track it. And sometimes I don't remember where I sent what. And I'm just like, no. So track your submissions. So there's 3 things. I'm sorry. SFWA would want me to say this. Read the contract and understand it and sign it. But if you have questions about the contract, SFWA furnishes all sorts of help with that. So don't sign anything you don't understand, please.
Excellent advice. Now, you mentioned behind you are a bunch of anthologies. In fact, I can see over your shoulder the Blackguards anthology, which I am in with you.
Yes. This is a beautiful one.
Yeah, it's a fantastic cover.
And I've got 2. I've got the hardback and the trade.
So do I.
This is a nice one. Yeah, this is a pretty one. Yeah, I really like this. And actually, I just did a short story with the same characters for Knaves.
Excellent. So that brings us, like, you talked a bit about magazines, and now obviously, particularly in the indie world where people can just sort of put together their own stuff, it seems like anthologies are another, well, I should ask, are anthologies another valid outlet for short fiction now?
I think so. And anthologies are really interesting because the sort of the word on the street has always been with traditional publishing that anthologies didn't make a lot of money, particularly if they did not have a big name editing, or, you know, kind of be like, well, this is the last Robert Jordan story to ever be published or something like that, right? But crowdfunding has made anthologies much more viable. And I was talking to one of the Kickstarter folks, Margot Atwell, and she said anthologies are one of the things that just absolutely do wonderfully on Kickstarter. And that makes it a model which I think is much more viable. And I love crowdfunded stuff. I think that's such a cool publishing model too.
Okay, so let's say you're an epic fantasy author like myself, and my novels are typically 100,000 words plus, and I wanted to try my hand at short fiction. Is there any sort of advice you could give me? Because I know, for instance, that there's no way in heck I think I can do it, because I'm so used to being able to describe what I want, you know, I have all the conversations that I want, and I will blow by the prereqs of a novelette or a novella with no time flat. So I was wondering what the advice would be.
So I would take one character and give them a problem, and then what will happen, I suspect, if you're used to writing novels, is other characters will keep kind of popping up and kind of demanding more and more time, and you're going to have to ruthlessly kneecap them every time they try to grab the story.
Good adjective. They want to come up, I want to say something. Down he goes. Nope.
No.
All right.
That's probably good advice just from the reader's point of view too, because I've been trying to read more short fiction just because it's easier to finish than an epic fantasy novel. And boy, if there's a lot of characters in a short story, I get so lost and confused. I'm just like, pass, go on to the next one. I don't know what's happening.
Well, that's when I'm revising. One of the things I do is I go through, look at the characters and see if there's any that I can combine. Because if I can make one character do the work that 2 or 3 are doing, that's much better. Because the more characters you have on stage, the more confusing it gets.
Maybe that's why I tend to go toward novels too, because my characters like to branch out. Why would I have a sorceress when I can have a sorceress and a sentient sword together on the page? So you don't do just short fiction. You've got 2 novels out, it looks like, and you're the Tablet Quartet. Is it going to be a force?
It is going to be a quartet, mainly because I'm contrary to everybody else who's doing trilogies. So I figured a quartet would be a good way to do it. And I'm a good chunk into the 3rd book. They've come out with, the first 2 came out with Kevin J. Anderson's Wordfire Press. And actually,
for those on the audio, she's going back to her bookshelf. And there we have it.
It's so pretty. And this is actually, it's a world that I've written I think I've written a couple of dozen short stories in it as well, and have some stuff coming up out of it. So, yeah.
All right, cool. And what made you decide, I mentioned before we started recording, we just had Kevin on the show a couple weeks ago and he was talking about Wordfire Press. What made you decide to go that route? I don't know if you were thinking, well, maybe I should do Big 5 if I can, because you seem like someone that would have a few connections. But, you know, Kevin is doing a lot of cool things too, so I can understand why it would be fun to publish with him.
Well, I actually have an agent who had shopped it around, and you know, it was kind of like, you're the next China Mutable, blah, 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 blah. And it was wonderful. I mean, very ego stoking, but then it didn't sell. And so I was very discouraged, and I was coming back on a cross-country trip, and I stopped at Mile High Con in Colorado, and I ran into my friend Peter Wax, who was an acquisitions editor for Wordfire Press, and I was like, Peter, I have a fantasy that I think is just about ready to go, and, you know, being an author, I was like, and I think it's doing things with fantasy that no one else has done before, and he bought into it and said, send it to me, and then said, sure, Wordfire would love to publish this. And I've been very happy with Wordfire. They've been very, I think, very kind and very professional. And I like working with Kevin. I think Kevin's a real stand-up guy.
Oh, definitely. He's a really cool guy. And it's great to see that a lot of authors are finding success and routes out there without just like, there's these 5 publishing houses and that's what you're limited to. What has it been like as far as marketing? You know, I assume you might have a little more control on price because you know these guys.
Yeah.
Have you been able to like try to do some sales and have they been great with working with that kind of thing?
Oh, they've been super. And like one of the things they did when Hearts of Tibet came out was they made sure that the first book was in a story bundle that came out at the same time. And so that was awesome, right? At least I hope that was awesome. Yeah, they've been, I think, you know, it's not like a big publishing house that's going to be like, now we're going to send you on a book tour and you're going to go to Chicago and here and here and here. And it's more like me calling them and saying, hey, I'm going to happen to be in Chicago. Do you want me to try and set some stuff up? Will you try and get the books there? And they're good about working with me on stuff. They've been good about like sending out review copies. And they're working on the audiobook right now, which is super.
Always nice if you don't have to finance that one yourself. I will say, since I just paid for one.
That's it.
Now, are you finding that, you mentioned that your story is maybe a little different than what's out there on the shelves. Can that be a deterrent or make it harder to find sort of that traditional publishing deal? Do you find they're more likely to like, we know this kind of thing sells, so we want more of this? And I don't know, what do you think? Is it worth always taking that shot if that's your goal?
It really depends. Yeah, if you're someone who's always been like, I want to go in Barnes and Noble and, you know, like you go into Barnes and Noble and you look at the top 10 shelf and you're like, my book will be right there someday, then sure, pursue traditional publishing. But be aware that it's a crapshoot. And there is no guarantee that even if a traditional publisher takes your book, that you will be part of that top 10. In fact, the odds are very strong that you will not. Be aware that traditional publishers are asking the authors to do more of the marketing. That, you know, maybe not in terms of financial cost, but in terms of time cost, and writing time cost is a biggie. I am quite honestly a little cynical about traditional publishing. And, you know, I'm trying to be diplomatic about it. You know, I have many friends that are traditionally published and they seem very happy with what they're doing. I like indie publishing and I like smaller press publishing because to me, it seems to give me more of the money, and I like having money for my writing.
That's how you define a professional writer, I believe, is that you make money writing. So it's like, well, you know, if this is what I can do to keep doing it, I'm going to keep doing it. All right. So I got another question about short fiction versus long fiction. How does your process differ when planning and writing novels versus planning and writing short fiction?
How's
your process differ?
Oh, my process differ. Well, novels are much longer, and I would turn the screen so you could see actually the current novel, but then you would see how messy the study is. But I have a whole bunch of cards taped up on the wall over here with things written all over them, and each card represents a chapter. So novels, I spend a lot more time kind of thinking about them ahead of time, a lot more time plotting them out. Whereas short stories start in all different kinds of ways, and sometimes they come complete, and sometimes they're just a nebulous idea, and sometimes there's somebody asked me for a story. Like somebody asked me for a story that it was for an anthology on mental illness and fantasy, and so I wrote a story about a former paladin with PTSD. You know, so that gave me my prompt.
That's excellent. So if you're trying to write a short story, like there's fairly standard formulas for writing a novel where it's like, you know, here's your 3-act structure and blah, blah, blah. But like a short story, it seems like, whereas earlier I was saying it's a lot less flexible because you have a lot less words to work with. It seems like it could also be more flexible because you don't have to necessarily adhere to a firm structure anymore. So
Right.
The question, I guess, would be, how do you know when a short story has everything it needs?
Well, So the basic demand is that something has to change, right? Something, you can't just be a static thing. And I would argue that you have to add a clause to that and say something has to change in a way that is satisfying to the reader. And that's pretty much what it boils down to. And you could talk about, there's like the classic, people talk about try-fail, try-succeed, or they talk about kind of Freytag's triangle where the tension rises and falls. But you're always going to find stories that violate that. You're always going to find stories that work against that structure. But you're never, I don't think you're never going, I hate to say never, but I can't think of any story where nothing changes.
All right. So do you maintain a set schedule or goals when you write?
I do. I try to do 2,000 words a day. And I say to myself, those don't have to be good words. They just have to be words, because I think that's really important. And I defend my morning tooth and claw. If people, I try not to schedule stuff during the morning, and I will not answer the phone. I will put it in the other room and ignore it, because that's my best time for writing.
Kind of leads into my next question is what sort of an environment do you need for writing? Do you need an environmentally clean room, no distractions, no nothing? Or
Well, I travel a lot, so I've tried to be better about sort of writing in unexpected places. And I'm good at coffee shop writing. I do have friends, and I'll be like, I'm going to go up to the coffee shop and write. And basically our structure is that we gossip for 10 minutes and then we write for 50. But most of the time, for me, an optimal writing conditions is a room that is quiet and where nobody's going to wander in. My husband, if he's here, will sometimes wander in to show me kitten pictures, which is adorable, but at the same time, somewhat distracting. But at the same time, one does not want to say, go away and don't show me kitten pictures. So I get more writing done when he's not here.
Yeah, I always love getting the text messages. What you doing?
What you doing?
Full-time writer here, kind of busy. Oh, what you writing about? Oh my God, really?
It's tough when you work from home because other people seem to think that you can, of course you can go pick something up or run to the post office. I mean, you're not doing anything. You're just at home. Why wouldn't you be available?
I had a friend of mine who said, you'll come out for coffee with me, but you always leave after exactly an hour has passed. And I was like, dude, yes. Mentally, I'm like, I have allotted an hour and now it's time to go because I could be writing.
See, I would be even worse. I would show up with my laptop and be like, oh, did you not mean, I thought we would just kind of work at the same time at the same table together and, enjoy our experience together while getting things done.
I like that. I'll try that next time.
All right. Yes, I highly recommend it to all people, all writers going on coffee dates.
There you go.
Well, in addition to your new novel, you also published a book called Moving from Idea to Finished Draft. That could be the subject of a whole podcast, but would you like to give a couple of tips for maybe writers out there that find themselves getting stuck?
Yeah, absolutely. This was because people kept asking me, how do I separate good ideas from bad ideas? Meaning, how do I pull out the ideas where I'm going to write it through and it's going to end up being a story versus I'm going to give up in despair halfway through? And that's not really the question, because I would argue that you can almost always flesh out whatever idea, how inane or stupid it seems to be, into a story. And for proof of that, I will point to the fact that Michael Swanwick has I think it's a novelette that takes place. It's basically people traveling over the surface of a giant grasshopper. And it is a perfectly plausible and wonderful story. So what you have to do is different manifestations give you different stuff, and you have to kind of look at the form. Like if you have just a character, that's going to give you different things to start with than, say, if you've got just a title, or if you've got the ending scene, or if you've got that anthology call where it's just sort of like mental illness in fantasy. And so the trick is really to sort of look at it, figure out what it gives you, and figure out what holes you have to fill in. And so that's what I've done in this book is kind of, I think there's like 24 ways ideas can manifest. And of course I discovered a new one as soon as I'd finished the book and it was all print. But I've also done an incredibly egocentric thing, which is that each section is, I included one of my stories that started that way. Partially to avoid copyright issues, because I hold copyright to all my own stories, and honestly, that is the main reason. But also because that gives people a way to say that's how this story started. It started as somebody saying, "I want to write a numbered list story," and that's what resulted. And I hope that's useful.
Do you find there's anything different when, like, I feel like short stories are great. If you have like this just crazy out there idea, it can be a short story. Where it might be hard to make into a whole novel. But do you find that there's a difference between like just coming up with a cool idea that you want to explore versus like you know the character really well, and what is something that would happen to the character based on the kind of person they are and what they desire? Like those are my favorite types of stories and come most easily for me. I kind of struggle a little bit if it's idea first and then I make up the characters.
Well, so I've done both. And I mean, the cool thing about characters is you immediately kind of like, well, what does the character want? And how do I thwart them? Gives you all sorts of possibilities. But I do, like, one of my favorite stories that I've written, basically the idea was feral appliances. And I wanted to use the line, something like, something being like the Dremel being the raccoon of the feral appliance world. And so there, if you've got an idea like that, you kind of think about, well, what are the problems that would present and who would it present problems for? I mean, it always sort of boils back down to kind of who's your character, because your character is always going to shape the story.
Yeah. So now we're talking about craft a lot right now, and specifically, how to educate yourself in craft. Do you feel like a would-be writer should take some time to learn the craft before they try their hand at writing, or do you think you should write first and see if you have any aptitude for it and then try to hone afterward?
I think you should write and write and write and write and probably be sending stuff out or at least giving it to other people to look at. I think the more writing that you do, the better. And I think one of the things that you want to do is plunge right in, because two things. One is that we know how to tell stories because we have been exposed to stories since we were little children. We've been told fairy tales and myths, and we've seen advertising and TV. I mean, we've swum in stories. We know how to do it. It's just that some people are better at it than others. But if you are practicing deliberately, right, it's not a question of like writing a million words. People will tell you that, and that's kind of bogus. It's a question of saying, okay, this is my writing and I'm good with X, but I'm not very good at Y. So I'm going to spend some time focusing on Y. I'm not very good at sort of sketching out characters. So I'm going to spend a day where I'm just writing out character. And I think that sort of practice ends up being really useful.
Alrighty, so being president of SFWA, you've obviously been exposed to many novels and short stories. Are there any common mistakes you see people making that could have easily been prevented? Bad covers, typos in blurbs, stuff like that?
Yeah, boy, not getting an editor is huge. And I think that that is one of the things that really can make a book look amateurish versus looking professional. And I say that as someone who has myself, skipped an editor and then went, oh shit, that is not something I should have done. I think that if you are newer and if you can afford it, probably a developmental editor somebody who's looking at your rough draft and is kind of like, here are the big picture things that you want to focus on, may be super, super useful. And in fact, will be super useful if you've got a decent editor, but not everybody can afford that. So it may be a case of kind of getting a beta reader. Get a decent cover. Because again, a crappy cover is something you want something that's going to make someone pick it up from the dealer's table. And That's important.
It always makes me laugh when they say that you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover. Well, as an author, I know that is the exact opposite. Because I do it all the time. It's like, oh, that looks good. That cover looks great. Let's move over to the blurb. But if I see an ugly amateurish cover, I'm like, eh.
Yeah.
And I'll move on to the next book.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's working at book tables at cons. You see people, they pick it up based on the cover. They turn it over. They read the back. And then maybe they open it up and check out the writing. And it's just sort of this each step of that has to invite them in.
Yeah, that's just as important on Amazon and the online stores as at the conventions. You wouldn't think so. Like the cover is only his little thumbnail on the page, but boy, I've certainly had different experiences just based on, like, it's kind of a similar high fantasy story, but cover was much better on this one. And surprise, surprise, it does a lot better when I get some ads and stuff. Okay, so we have to ask you the obligatory SFWA questions since you're holding office over there. Yeah. We actually had MCA Hogarth on the show about 3 years ago.
I love Maggie.
She was doing stuff with SFWA back then, but I think we only had like 3 listeners at the time. So for those who may not remember or didn't listen, could you remind us all like what exactly SFWA is and why authors should be interested?
Okay. So SFWA is an international organization. It is a nonprofit corporation, a 501c, and I hope I got that right, or C3. It is a nonprofit corporation. We've got about 2,000 members. They're all professional writers or people who are associated with fantasy and science fiction writing in some way. It started over 50 years ago because some of the big name writers saw that small name writers were basically getting screwed by publishers and sometimes not getting paid or getting paid badly. And so the big name writers said, we will form a group where we can use our collective clout. And so that's what SFWA is. SFWA is it's a way for writers to kind of exercise a little control over an industry that is very uncontrollable. And so SFWA does things like we try to keep people aware of scams. We've got a Writer Beware is one of our websites, and that tells people about bad editors, bad agents, and sort of predatory practices. We have the model contracts, which they're not just sort of a model contract that publishers can use, but it explains each and every clause. So for a writer, it's an education. They can go through and go, okay, now I understand how this clause works, and I understand whether or not it's important to push back on it or not. We have just such a huge range of stuff that it's hard for me to touch on all of it. But I will say, we voted to admit independent writers a few years ago. And Maggie and I were both people who helped lead that effort among a huge amount of people. And it was, in my opinion, one of the smartest things that the organization has done. And it's brought a huge amount of expertise and energy to us. And one of the things that has also done is that we have worked even harder at trying to provide stuff that's useful to authors, and particularly indie authors. So we have a NetGalley membership, and that lets people purchase a NetGalley slot for their book for $25 a month, as opposed to buying a NetGalley membership, which is $600 or $700 a year. We have our new release newsletter. We have the Story Bundle project, where we have a couple of story bundles that are done each year that are SFWA specific. There's a huge amount of stuff. We just implemented a mentorship program. It's, it just like stuff keeps rolling out all the time. And it's also a great source of community. I was just at Worldcon, and SFWA has a suite at Worldcon, and we had over 500 people came through the suite over the course of the weekend. And it was just so cool to hang out and see some pretty venerable names there and get a chance to just hang out with them. That was actually pretty insane. So yeah, it's really cool.
I look forward to one day when I will be considered venerable. I don't know in what field it will be in, but I'm sure it must happen eventually, right? Just by continuing to publish.
If we exist, we just keep existing, it will happen. Oh, and I should mention the Nebula Conference, the Nebula Awards that we give each year too. So there, yeah.
And the requirements used to be, I think, like 3 short story sales to pro magazines or a novel to a bigger publisher. What is it now that indie authors are allowed to apply?
So as a result of letting the indies in, we have gotten increasingly complicated. And one of the things that we did at the most recent board meeting was try and figure out how we're going to simplify that. So we're working on simplifying it. So let me say, there are 3 tiers of SFWA membership. There is there's associate membership where you can go join on just the strength of 1 story sale. And that story sale needs to have been at 6 cents a word. And SFWA likes to look at the contract and make sure that things are on the up and up. And so they do kind of check that over. Or if you sold it on like Amazon, like you self-published it and you sold it on Amazon, you would need to send some royalties, some royalty statements, not the actual money, but the royalty statements. And we would look at that. And those are folks who can, I believe the distinction is that they can nominate for the nebulas, but not vote. Whereas the active members are the people that have come in with 3 stories. And you can start as associate that's how I started as associate, and then you bump yourself up. So either 3 short stories at that criteria, 6 cents a word, or a single book from which you have made $3,000 over the course of a year. And that can be royalties, that can be an advance, it can be a combination of the 2. Someone asked about print versus electronic, and it could be the print and the electronic. I don't think that the audiobook counts as well. But if you mail office@sfwa.org, our executive director understands all the intricacies of this much better than I and can sort that out. And she can answer complex questions about boxed sets as well. And the 3rd category of membership is the affiliate. And those are the folks who are editors or publishers or reviewers or some otherwise connected. I hope. And I know it's horribly complicated. And we do have a web form that will walk people through most of this.
I should, since we're showing things off on this episode, I should show that I have a SFWA membership card. I've been a member of SFWA since 2015, which I believe is right when you opened up for us indies. But there's a lot. I mean, this is a genre guild, but there's a lot of different writers guilds. Is it considered bad form for someone to become a member of more than one, or like
no,
how that works?
Not at all. No, we've got lots of people that belong to RWA and SFWA, or HWA, or the Mystery Writers, or Authors Guild. We've got lots of cross stuff going.
And like for someone like me, like when I was aware of SFWA, we interviewed, but whenever it comes to joining a group like this, my concern is that I'm not going to get anything out of it, but that's less my concern and more that I'm just not the kind of person who would benefit from it. Like I am not a terribly outgoing person. Like, should people be concerned that they're not going to get the value out of being a member, even if they join up?
I would argue that we have enough stuff going that's kind of, that you can passively use, that it would be worthwhile. I mean, and that's one of the things that I have tried to do is make sure that it's kind of value for people's money. I will say that, like many organizations, volunteering is going to end up kind of being a better experience in terms of networking and sort of community building and just sort of sheer enjoyment. And we do have volunteer roles for introverts as well as extroverts. But it's also, and we've got the discussion boards, and depending on what kind of introvert you are, you could end up spending huge amounts of time on those discussion boards. So yeah, I would say yes, but I would say you're going to get more if you're willing to kind of put energy into it. I do think like the Nebula Conference is amazing now. I mean, it used to be kind of interesting, and now it's just like freaking amazing. And so I would come to that. And I would say one of the things that we do at the Nebulas is try to make sure that even the introverts are comfortable. One of the things we do is we have this mentorship program where if it's your first time at the Nebulas, you get a mentor if you want one. It's not mandatory.
All right. So one of the things that Ms. Hogarth chatted with us about all those years ago with regards to the benefits of the SFWA membership was the availability of a legal team should the need ever arise.
Right.
Are there any other benefits that authors would be surprised about?
So we have the Emergency Medical Fund. And the Emergency Medical Fund is designed for writers who are having a temporary medical emergency that is preventing them from writing. And people write in and apply, and the fund gives out grants. I think that they move very quickly. They move pretty discreetly, and they're there to to help folks. And sometimes I will look for people that are, I think could take advantage of it and point it out to them. The legal fund, I know legal fund helped Maggie when they were suing her over the phrase Space Marines, right? The Games Workshop was trying to copyright that. So it's there. SFWA now has also most of a lot of the stuff that comes in, it goes into what we call our Givers Fund. And that Givers Fund feeds into the Emergency Medical Fund, feeds into the Legal Fund, and also feeds into our grants program. And the grants program gives out grants to organizations that are promoting fantasy and science fiction. So money went out last year to Launchpad, to Alpha, which is a young writers workshop, to establish several reading series in different cities, to a science fiction festival in, I forget which African country. It was like African Science Fiction Festival. A bunch of stuff like that. And so that's a really cool thing. SFWA has a speakers bureau. If you go to speakers.sfwa.org, if you're interested in getting teaching or speaking gigs, I think there's like 225 speakers. If you are looking for someone to speak for your event, in fact, that is there too. SFWA runs the Estates Project, which one of the things that it does is try to connect the estates make sure that estates are getting represented and that agents and publishers can connect with them and find stuff if they want to reprint it. And right now, as a kind of offshoot of that project, in memory of the guy who ran our estates program for many years, a wonderful volunteer named Bud Webster, we're running the Preserve Your Legacy campaign, where what we're trying to do is educate people about how to appoint a literary executor and what that executor needs and how to preserve your work and how to archive your work. It's they're putting together information on that.
All right, yeah, I will say also for the record, I don't have my card in front of me, but been a member active member since 2014.
Well, I love those membership cards because I have such a great team, and every once in a while they just prove me totally wrong. And so, and people have been asking for the membership cards, and I was just like, oh, that's why would, and I was just like, nobody would carry that around. And then Kate is like, no, people were really going to like this. And I was like, okay, let's do it. And then everybody loves them. And of course they turned out beautifully, and I can see why one would carry one around in the wallet now. But I was dubious to start with, and now I'm a convert.
All right, one last question from me, because I'm curious, you mentioned the Nebula Conference. Is that the one in May?
It is.
Oh, okay.
It'll be in LA the next 2 years.
Because I was scoping it out, because you came to my coast. I'm, down here in Arizona. I was like, I could actually drive over there. Last year, was the first year it was on my radar, because I honestly thought it was like, oh, you go and there's some awards ceremony and people network. But then you had Data Guy. And so I was like, wait a minute, you guys actually have all these like panels and workshops, I think. And it sounded a lot like a lot of the indie conferences out there that are actually helpful in marketing and everything you need to know. So could you tell us a little bit about what is offered and why folks might want to show up?
It is one of the things that I'm really proud of having come about during my presidential reign of terror. The Nebula Conference used to be basically a bunch of science fiction writers honestly getting together in a bar for the weekend and doing the banquet and the award ceremony. And I think the first time I went, there was like a single track of programming, and it was something like writer's block. And, I was just like, I'm sorry, no disrespect to previous programming. It is now, we've got multiple tracks going on. And one of the coolest things is that the person who's been handling the events programming, Mary Robinette Coal, makes sure that there are advocates for all the different groups on her programming committee. So there's somebody who's an advocate for the indie writers. There's somebody who's an advocate for, gay and lesbian or disabled, because like one of the things that we want to make sure is that we have programming that appeals to everyone, right? We want to make sure that there's stuff that's useful to everyone. We want people to have a reason to come. One of the things that I'm really proud of is last year we had our first reception honoring the partners and spouses, which I thought was a really nice way to show the partners and spouses that we appreciated them. And the lovely thing is we got Kay Haldeman, who is Joe Haldeman's wife, was our wonderful, wonderful hostess and will continue to be. The mentor program, they have cool stuff like office hours, where it's just basically, here are people with expertise in some particular area where you can come and just ask them questions. So like, come and ask an astronaut questions about what it's like to be on the space station. Come and ask a microbiologist about, sort of what do they do every day in the lab. And just a kind of a really wide range. And some fun stuff, like how to apply makeup, which I think is actually kind of handy for, if you're going to be doing a video cast and you want to know how to do the thing, which I don't usually do. That's a useful thing. And it's nice. I mean, the Nebula banquet is just it's a lovely occasion. And we had Peter S. Beagle with us this year, and he came to the reception and sang us all a song and read us a story. And I get all weepy just even thinking about it. So yeah, it's a lovely, lovely time, and I highly recommend it. But I have not just drunk the Kool-Aid, but brew it now. So remember that.
All right. Well, that sounds great. And like much more than I thought. Like I always had this perception of SFWA as kind of like, maybe because you did have to have the pro sales and the novel sales, that like compared to RWA, which always seemed like, oh, come, if you're serious about being a writer, just come to the stuff. So I'm really pleased to hear that and see that everything's changing and that it's friendly to indies and to everybody that wants to be a serious writer now. So, and thank you for taking the time. I'm sure you get asked all the time, what are the SFWA? Tell me about it. So I appreciate you coming and talking about that, and also about your own work and short fiction, submitting to magazines and stuff. Can you remind us so people can check out your novels? And I noticed you have a lot of your short fiction has been published or by the magazines and such, and like back issues that people can buy on Amazon.
Well, I've got a couple collections, if they want to check them out. One's Near Plus Far, and the other one's Neither Here Nor There, and they're kind of cool because they're double-sided. And the novels are the Tabat books. The first one is Beasts of Tabat. Most of my stuff is available on Amazon, and you can find me on just about every social media network as Cat Rambo. All
right, sounds good. And your website, was it Kitty something? I have it written in the notes. It's not your name.
Well, yeah, I forgot to tell you, I love the name of your website.
I like the Kitty Wumpus. It's become a sort of a little totem. Yeah, a friend of mine drew one at one point for me. But catrambo.com will work too.
All right, we appreciate you answering all of our questions and hanging out with us for over an hour here. I will put the links to some of your stories that you mentioned and your novels up there so people can check them out. Awesome. I believe we are. Is this episode 196? We're getting up there. So if anybody's looking for those links, come on by marketingsff.com and you can hop over and find everything. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for listening, everyone.
All right, guys, I'll take it easy. Thanks for hanging out with us.
So long, everybody.